go ahead and call our September 23rd, 2020 meeting to order, and we'll start off with a moment of silence. If you'd all join and keep our brothers and sisters, both the police and fire, in your thoughts and prayers as we still navigate through a strange time. All right. Looking at our agenda, we have 8 items that are put down there, and we'll take care of our business. I will say that for our votes, which is for the item number 1 only, we do need to call for roll, so that'll either be done by Tammy or Steve. I'm not sure which one's going to conduct the roll. And it appears that everybody is on mute, and I would remind you, if you haven't, make sure you stay on mute until you're talking. And I think those are the directions that Tammy told me to pass on. So we'll look at item number 1, which is the approval of our July 2020 minutes.
Move approval, Jeff Holy.
All right. Jeff has made the motion to adopt. Is there a second?
Second.
I did. Okay, I think I've got Pat on Ade, I got you on screen, so I'll give you the second. All right, so we have a motion made and seconded to adopt our July 2020 minutes. Is there discussion on our minutes? Seeing none, as all those in favor, we will do a roll call vote.
Please stay on mute unless you're...
Ade? Yes.
AJ? AJ?
He might have been called out for a call.
Jason?
Yes.
Yeah. Jason?
Yes.
Pat McElligott?
Yes.
Representative Berquist?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Senator Rivers?
Yes.
Yeah, we got you. Thank you. Tarina?
Yes.
And Chair Lawson?
Well, yes.
All
right.
Passes.
Item number 2, which is the EMT study, and I'll turn over to Executive Director Nelson. Steve.
This part of the interim will begin kind of the board's completion of homework that you were given by the legislature last session. There were 3 items in particular legislation which you're about to hear, getting approval, IRS approval for survivor reelection legislation, which is the next topic, and then a joint the policy and military we will hear also this morning. This first item is probably familiar to most of the firefighters, but new to perhaps most of the other board members. King County delivering services or emergency medical services in a variety of different ways, using a variety of different administrative processes. And depending on how those processes worked, that decided whether you got membership in PERS or LEF or none at all, even though you might have been doing the exact same job with the exact same standards, with the exact same training. This presentation then from Jacob is sort of the introduction to this study requirement. With that, I will turn it over to Jacob.
Okay, Steve, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good morning, members. For the record, Steve started to discuss the issue in front of the board today. Is our emergency medical technicians who provided services in King County through intergovernmental consortiums eligible for retirement service credit in PERS. As you can tell, that issue had a mouthful, and we'll break that down a little more. So some background, and this was kind of news to me, but interesting to research, that King County was a pioneer in EMT services. In the early 70s, there was actually a episode where they claimed that was the best place in the world to have a heart attack. And that's in part because of how they were providing EMT services. One part of that was in 1970, the Seattle Fire Department and UW trained firefighters as paramedics. King County and other local governments formed intergovernmental consortiums providing EMS services over their shared areas. These consortiums consist of not all of these EMTs are enrolled in state retirement systems. I'll get into more detail with that. And then this inconsistency has resulted in piecemeal legislation in recent years to provide retirement benefits to EMTs on an employer-by-employer basis, instead of looking at the issue as a whole. So here I have the more specific language from the study. And so this study, it wasn't a bill, it was actually a budget proviso. Legislature gave two funds to complete a study of the pension benefits provided to these services in King County between 1978 and 2003. The study, the language provided said legal implications of extending membership in the plan, including the King County employers that might be included, the benefits that would be paid to members on a prospective and retroactive contribution and plan liability that would be created for employers, employees, and the state. And this study was due to the legislature by January 1st. So now to start getting into some of the high-level history of EMTs in Left Plan 2. Starting with King County, some local government EMTs had their jobs moved from local government to fire departments. Once those EMTs met the requirements to become firefighters, completing the training and testing, these EMTs employed by fire departments became members of Left Plan 2. In 2005, the definition of firefighter would include EMTs employed by a city, town, county, or district. Members of PERS were employed as EMTs, were transferred to Left 2 for prospective service at this time, and then they were allowed to transfer their past PERS service as EMTs into Left 2. In 2017, clarifying that public hospital to employers, that their EMTs were eligible as service credit in Left 2 retroactive to 2005, which some of you may be familiar with these for a longer period of time. Although I should add, public hospital districts not eligible service credit in PERS for 2005. Employment at a public hospital district had not opted into PERS. So that's a difference in PERS and LEF, is that there are some employer types that can opt into PERS, and so public hospital districts are one of those types, and some public hospital districts had never opted into PERS. And that issue will come back up. So some additional these consortiums, this issue has been dealt with on kind of a piecemeal basis. The first bill was in 2016, and a bill passed that allowed an employee providing EMS to a consortium of local governments to choose to establish service credit in PERS for service July 2003 if the service was performed in Snohomish County. And so this bill was for the Arlington Public Hospital District. It was a bill directly to the legislature. And in 2020, last session, there was a bill that sought to provide a similar benefit to for consortium and Evergreen Public Hospital District. During the legislative session, there were legal concerns raised regarding whether the determining eligibility of PERS was Evergreen Public Hospital District or King County. The Evergreen Public Hospital District was not a PERS employer. King County is a PERS employer, and so the employees of Evergreen Public Hospital District, not King County, and therefore they were never reported into PERS. If they were, PERS would raise potentially time qualification issues, and those were some of the legal concerns that were raised. And that's because you can't give employees of the employer working for the employer. So also in 2020, there was after the legal concerns were raised on that first bill, there was a second bill. Similar legal questions were raised about this bill, and then also some additional questions since it would have given these EMTs service credit and left to prior firefighters being eligible left to. And so those legal concerns raised for those two bills resulted in this study. So one of the legal questions raised by these employer consortiums is who is the employer? So the DRP scope of control, and it was a very long test, so I tried to break it down as easy as possible for you. So getting into like the 26 parts of the test, the delation part is the payer or direct only result of the work, not what will be done and how it will be done. To help determine this, the IRS behavioral control and relationship of the parties. So that's what the IRS and the courts will look at to determine who the employer is. And this issue may be familiar to you. There's more than a day. The lawsuit that went on for a long time and finally resolved in King County. And, in this case, the Supreme Court that employers of the public defender organizations hired by King County were employed under state law, and the Supreme Court used a scope of control to make that determination. And then after the court's decision, the legislature passed a law to try preventing similar situations by the employer for purposes of the Washington State retirement systems, and that employees of governmental contractors are not eligible for state retirement system membership. It also limited the determination of between contractors and a retirement system employer, not the relationship between a government contractor and a retirement system employer. How King County contracted and worked with the public defender employers, not the individual employees. We're talking about entities are all public entities. We're not talking a contractor to a public entity. Therefore, we're going to develop a legislative goal on retirement system eligibility of EMTs. So the next step, Council Irs Miller, in this study, we provided them a lot of documentation and information about and in King County, and so they are currently working on that, and they will have it complete before the board's November meeting. And then the left two board is also working with OSA and DRS on a fiscal analysis of what would be the potential cost and impact to the plan would be if these consortiums are put into PERS. And so this presentation issues really briefly, I'm sure a little confusing. It's just a high-level introduction, and we'll provide much more detail after we receive analysis from Irs Miller, and they can pinpoint for us the exact issues and what our options might be. If you have any questions.
Are there any questions for Jacob?
Was everyone having trouble? Text audio was cutting in and out the whole time.
You were a little choppy.
Okay. I'm going to try to turn my video off for my next presentation and see if that helps.
All right. Having no questions for Jacob, item number 2, I'll turn it back over to Steve again for item number 3, which is our survivor re-election issue.
Checking on call number 5 first.
We'll have to do that. So with the next item, item number 3, survivor re-election, as you'll recall from last session, the board recommended a bill that would create a window for left two retirees after the time they retired to change their survivor option. We learned that occasionally when a retiree gets their first retirement check, it doesn't match up with what they were expecting. And under current law, the survivor re-election is irrevocable. So even if they ended up with a significant difference in their pension amount, either higher or lower, they couldn't change their survivor benefit. We were aware of a couple of other plans in the country, especially Oregon, that had a benefit that created this window. And so the board recommended a bill last session. It was amended during session to apply to all the plans. But then a question was raised about whether or not the IRS would approve of this type of benefit. And so the legislation that applies to all the plans passed with an amendment that provides that DRS will seek a private letter ruling from the IRS. With that, I will turn it over to Jacob to kind of walk you through where we're at in this process.
Okay. Once again, for the record, Jacob White, staff to the board. Steve did a pretty good summary there of my presentation. The board is very familiar with this issue. You've received a lot of presentations about it over the last couple years from me. And so I'm going to try to keep it brief and update you on what has happened since we last discussed this issue and what the next steps are going to be. So the issue here is allowing members to change their survivor option election after retirement may raise plan qualification issues with the IRS. So some background on the legislation. The Left 2 board endorsed legislation to allow Left 2 retirees up to 90 calendar days after the receipt of their first retirement allowance to prospectively change their survivor election. The bill was amended during session to include all DRS-covered retirement plans, and this was something the board had discussed prior to session. The board saw this coming, and the other member organizations did want their members to also be able to do this. However, during session, Tax Council identified possible plan qualification issues with the bill, and so the bill was amended to not take effect until the state received a determination from the IRS that these changes conformed with federal law. The amended bill passed and was signed into law. So what are those plan qualification issues? Reannuitization of, have a hard time with that one, Treasury regulations. So these restrict the ability to reannuitize a pension after payments have started. And then the other plan qualification issue was non-increasing annuity Treasury regulations. And so what this means is upon reannuitizing, the value of the entire benefit cannot be increased by annuitizing it, except under limited circumstances. Our bill was not one of those limited circumstances identified by the IRS. However, it was not specifically identified you could do it. It just was not one of the examples the IRS shows. And then also with that one, so we're working with Irs Miller, but there is a question as far as whether it really is increasing the benefit to change your survivor benefit option, because survivor benefit options are supposed to be actuarially equivalent, meaning that they pay out the same amount of money no matter which option you choose. So the Irs Determination part of the bill, the Left 2 board staff we're currently working with DRX and Tax Council on next steps. Tax Council has advised us that the type of determination, there's multiple different ways you can go to the IRS and ask for a determination, but they've advised us that the most appropriate way is a private letter ruling. And they've also advised us that it makes the most financial sense to seek a single private letter ruling for all the DRS systems and plans. There is some question whether the IRS will actually allow that or make us do one for each system and plan. It is quite costly to submit a private letter ruling to the IRS. And so Irs Miller did feel pretty confident that they would accept one from all the systems and plans, since the bill language was the exact same language for each system and plan. And it didn't seem that it would make a difference. The different systems would change the IRS analysis at all. We also talked to Irs Miller about any alternative options instead of going for a private letter ruling, whether there was any way we could change the bill and allow this in a way that the IRS would be okay with. And so the answer was not really. So they did give us one option. A member could delay receiving their benefit until the benefit calculation has been finalized by DRS. This would allow the member more certainty about their benefit. However, it would delay them receiving a retirement benefit. So we didn't think that too many members would be interested in that alternative option. So the next steps, we are continuing to work with DRS and Tax Council to explore other alternative options and moving forward with submitting a request for a private letter ruling to the IRS. Ice Miller has warned us that private letter rulings can take up to a year. Sometimes they can be a little quicker than that, but they said, yeah, probably expect about a year for an answer from the IRS on that. So that completes my presentation. Any questions?
Jacob, this is Dennis. I have a question.
Okay.
When members go to retire, they take up the election, and there's 4 choices that they can choose from. And from what I understand, reselection process is you're changing from let's say letter A to letter B on those selection choices. How is that, I guess, increasing your pension? In fact, it's one of the options available. And like you said, I mean, the plan has been looked at, and the actuaries explored the impact the aging policy in place. How does that come to be?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's the same question me and Steve had. And so we're going to go back to Ice Miller on that and have them explain to us, why the IRS would be concerned about that, because it doesn't really make logical sense to us, especially in this case where it's 90 days, and so someone's only going to have received a few checks at a maximum at a different rate. And so, I was curious whether there could be an option that when they retroactively changes back to their first check, that would take care of the IRS concerns. So that's one of the issues we're going to continue to work with Ice Miller on, and then maybe having the actuaries help me out with explaining that to Ice Miller and see if we can understand IRS concerns. There's an alternative option.
All right, thank you. Any other questions for Jacob? All right, hearing that, go ahead. I'll turn it back over to Steve Nelson for item number 4, which is our interrupted military service. Go ahead, Steve.
All right. I understand we're having problems with the Wi-Fi here at work, and so my audio is also choppy for many of you. I apologize for that. The interrupted military service topic is one that the board is well familiar with. You've been talking about it for several years now. Last session, the board recommended a bill to correct some of the definitions to match federal legislation. That bill passed and was amended to apply to all the plans. At the same time, questions were raised about whether the benefit itself should be expanded to other types of military service besides just combat service. There were questions about the cost of that issue. There were questions about the policy of that issue. And the study was referred to the Select Committee on Pension Policy and to the Left 2 Board for this interim. With that, I will turn it over to Jacob to give you the details about the plan for the interim.
Okay, once the last couple of years, the issue is the impact of expanding no-cost interrupted military service credit to include those who have been awarded an expeditionary medal. So a member qualifies for current benefit leave of absence from a DRS-covered position to serve in the U.S. military, and the member returns to their employer after their military service is complete. There's two types of benefit they can receive. The one that everyone wants, the fully subsidized, which is also known as the no-cost interruptive military service credit. And that's obviously no cost to the member, not to the plan. And then the partially subsidized benefit. Which I should add, the partially benefit, the member pays their wages to pay the interest. So a reminder, Steve talked about this a little bit, but last session, the Left 2 board endorsed legislation on this topic, and that legislation redefined period of war to no longer identify specific conflicts, and instead to recognize all service from which a campaign badge or medal was earned. The intent that was discussed by the board last year was to prevent the need to continually go back to the legislature, keep asking to update and add either new conflicts or conflicts that were missed, where the medals were, they called upscaled by the Department of Defense. It was just causing a lot of confusion and the need to keep going back and have more and more bills. So this way on that. And the Left 2 board believed it was never the intent of the statute to exclude certain conflicts where members earned campaign badges or medals from receiving this no-cost interrupted military service credit benefit. So during they're initially proposed amending the benefit to expand the definition of period of war to include those who received an expeditionary medal. The cost of this was unknown, and so that resulted in that bill being amended to require this study with the Left 2 board and the Select Committee on Pension Policy taking a look at what those costs would be and the policy benefits. So the Left 2 board and the Select Committee endorsed the original legislation that created the no-cost interrupted military service credit benefit. And to receive the no-cost service credit, the member's service must be during a period of war, which is defined below. The main one that's been at issue, as I discussed, was earned a campaign badge or medal, as opposed to other types of medals. So a quick reminder, the campaign medal recognizes the highest level of personal risk and is when members are deployed to where the combat is actually occurring. Expeditionary medal, also high level of personal risk and hardship for members, but they are typically in support of combat operations instead of in combat operations. That is the main difference between these two. Although sometimes people can earn an expeditionary medal and be in a combat operation, but it does not rise to the level or has not been recognized as earning a campaign medal by the Department of Defense. So in recent years, attempts at pricing expanding to expeditionary medals have failed to provide an estimate. We've requested data at the federal, state, local level. Every time I get my hopes up that I've found the data source, end up not quite being there. And so have better news so far this interim. We found two data sources that are going to, it looks like, allow the actuary to price this benefit increase, benefit improvement. One of those was we've started surveying other states, which also provided interesting policy analysis, not just potential pricing analysis. And so the states that got back to us that were helpful were Idaho, Minnesota, Oregon, and Wisconsin. What we did find from a policy standpoint is that none of these states distinguished between metals, badges, or other levels of risk. They just did if you had interruptive military service, then you qualified, and if you didn't qualify. So Minnesota and Oregon did not offer a no-cost benefit, but Idaho and Wisconsin did offer a no-cost benefit, and they just had the no requirement for any kind of metal. It was just interruptive military service credit qualified for that no-cost benefit. So because those benefits, we were able to get data from them, which I'll show you on the next slide, but because those benefits were broader than what's being considered by Washington, it could be useful for OSA, but they ended up finding a potentially better data source. And so that data source actually came from the Washington State Military Department. And they had data on National Guard members in Washington State and the medals that those members earned. And so from that, the actuaries were able to get a ratio of campaign medals compared to expeditionary medals. And so they're currently working on pricing the benefit using that data. But they're in the midst of it right now. So here's the information we got from other states, if you're interested in that. Won't go through it in detail. Oh, and I should add the other piece of data that the actuaries needed to price this was the average months deployed. So they would be able to estimate the amount of service credit the members would potentially qualify for. So the study requirements requires the Left 2 board and select committee to communicate their preliminary recommendations prior to October 30th, 2020. And so this will be our last board meeting where we discuss policy options. We do have next month's meeting, but we will not be discussing this at that meeting. So we will be able to send over a preliminary report to select committee. And we've been working very closely with OSA, who staffs the select committee on this issue, kind of breaking up the different requirements of the study, and so we can save resources and time and work together on that. And then the Left 2 and the select committee must issue a final recommendation to the legislature by January 2nd, 2021. So next steps, the data we've gathered, we've provided to the actuaries. The actuaries, as I said, are looking at both that and the data they've gathered from the National Guard. And preliminary pricing should be completed before the board's November meeting. And yeah, and then as I said, the board must share our preliminary report to the select committee next month. So we will be sending that on over to them. That completes my presentation. Are there any questions I can answer?
Jacob, without those numbers right now, what's your recommendation?
So I'm going to repeat to make sure I understood you. Without those numbers, what is the recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, you don't have the cost,
yes,
number of people, so what do you say? I mean, I know it's preliminary, until January 3rd, but do we have to have a recommendation, or is it just a report on what we've worked on?
Yeah, so talked with Steve about this so he can jump in, but my understanding is that, yeah, because we don't have the pricing, the board can't be expected to make a recommendation on what they, if they believe this benefit increase improvement should occur. So our plan was to share our the research we've done so far, the report to the select committee. They'll share theirs with us. They may have preliminary recommendations since they are meeting next month and planning on discussing about it, but I'm not sure whether they'll get those recommendations in time or not. But I believe from reading the requirements of the study, that the intent of the legislature was that the Select Committee and Left 2 Board would work together on this, so that there'd be consistency between the benefits, and I think that's clearly occurring.
Yeah, I agree. We've talked about that with OSA about the timing. The board has made recommendations in the past, so, you know, I guess from a technical sense, you could say that the board's recommendation is no change unless the cost of the increase can be determined. But we'll keep working on them through the interim, and we should have a little bit more clarity for you by November, December, about whether the Select Committee is moving forward with the issue at all.
All right, thank you. Any other questions for Jacob? All right, looking at our list, item number 5 is Seattle Police Plan demographics. And I know this question came up, I believe it was our last meeting live this issue today. So, Executive Director Nelson, back over to you.
Yes, you're correct, Mr. Chair. This issue came up at the July Left 2 Board meeting. There were a number of media reports about potential changes to the Seattle Police Department budget, up to and including, you know, the possibility of laying off 700 officers. That led to questions from board members and other stakeholders about whether or not that kind of change to the overall membership of the plan created any financial risks or other concerns for the plan. We've been working with the actuary on getting some answers to those questions, and Jacob will let you know what we've learned so far.
Okay, good morning. For the record, in the last time today, Jacob White, staff of the board. So as Steve said, at the July meeting, questions were raised regarding the potential impacts to Left Plan 2 if there are significant layoffs and or retirements at the Seattle Police Department. Over the last few months, there were some demands for 50% cut to the Seattle Police Department, and the City Council of Seattle proposed cuts, which included eliminating about 100 Seattle Police Department positions, which was approximately a 7.5% cut through layoffs and attrition. The mayor actually vetoed those proposed cuts. And then just last night, the City Council voted to override her veto. And the City Council may propose more cuts in future budgets. Okay, so the analysis we asked for from the actuaries, we asked them to look at 4 hypothetical scenarios. And I do want to stress these are all hypothetical scenarios. The termination of the 700 least senior active members from the Seattle Police Department with no replacement members. And so this was about a 50% cut. Termination of the 90 least senior and retirement of the 90 most senior active members with no replacement members. And then hypotheticals 3 and 4 were not just Seattle Police Department, but for the plan as a whole. And so this was a reduction in assumed, or hypothetical 3 was a reduction in assumed future salary growth by 0.25%, and 4 was a reduction in the number of assumed annual future hires by 0.25%. I should add that for 3, the current rate is, to give you an idea of what a 0.25% decrease would look like, it's the current rate is 3.5% general salary growth as expected. And then there's a service-based salary increase that varies by the amount of service the member has. So when I ask the actuaries for that, it's of course a complicated formula, or at least more complicated than it would appear. And then for hypothetical 4, the annual growth assumption is 0.85%. So as you know, actuaries like disclaimers, and so I normally don't include these in the presentations, but just given the nature of the subject matter of this presentation, I want to go ahead and just include these in a slide. I'm not going to read through them for you. Just want to make sure those were available for anyone who takes a look at this presentation. And just as a reminder, as the actuaries often say, these are a snapshot in time of the data, and it would could change, based on where we're at in the future, and the specifics of how any of these hypotheticals would actually be carried out could impact the analysis. So just a quick look at the current plan demographics and how Seattle Police Department compares to Left 2 as a whole. As you see, the salary difference is the main thing you see there, and then just an idea of how large of an employer Seattle Police Department is in Left 2. The age and service are pretty comparable to the rest of the plan. So hypothetical number 1, the 50% cut. So the actuarial analysis on this one was that it would project to result in an overall savings to the plan. It would be a 0.01% decrease to the contribution rate and a 0.3% increase to the plan funded status. And so the reason these savings would occur is that the termination of members who are early in their careers results in a savings because these members will receive a lower benefit than if they had remained in the plan, earning more service credit and higher earnings. So hypothetical 2 was about a 13% reduction, and this was the 90 least senior are terminated and 90 most senior retire. This projected to be an overall cost to the plan, but the cost was so small that it resulted in no impact to the contribution rate and a 0.2% decrease to the plan funded status. And so the reason this was a cost to the system is that more retirements of Left 2 members than expected is a cost because those members begin to draw their benefits immediately. Hypothetical number 3, this was one of the whole plan, not just limited to Seattle Police Department options. And so this was or not options, hypotheticals, a reduction in assumed future salary growth by 0.25%. And this was projected by the actuaries to result in an overall savings to the plan. It would be a 0.26% decrease to the contribution rate and a 0.6% increase to the plan funded status. And so why would this result in a savings? Lowering future salary growth results in lower expected benefits upon retirement and is a savings to the plan. However, the system will also have lower future salary to collect contributions over, which creates cost. However, the lower retirement benefit savings offset the costs from lower contributions to result in an overall contribution rate reduction. And the last hypothetical, this was a reduction in the number of assumed annual future hires by 0.25%, is projected to result in an overall savings to the plan. However, at this point, OSA could not provide us with the projected contribution rate and impact of this, or the funded status impact. They have to wait till the 2019 AVR is complete, which we'll be able to provide to the board once that is done. So the take of this analysis is that these hypotheticals have minor impacts to the plan, contribution rate, and funding status. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Any questions for Jacob? All right. hearing any, not seeing anybody. All right, thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Ade.
Yes. Thank you very much, Jacob. I was just wondering, did we factor in any impact on the salary growth due to any of these options? Because based on what you just showed on one of the slides, the salary for Seattle police officers is probably one of the highest and probably a major driving force in salary in other cities. So did we factor in salary growth or the impact of salary of Seattle decision on salary growth for this study?
Yes, I believe that is covered in hypothetical number 3, where we looked at a reduction in the future salary growth of the whole plan by 0.25%.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Any other questions for Jacob? All right, seeing or hearing no other questions, we'll go ahead and move on to item number 6, OPMA and ethics.
As board members, you are required to undergo annual training regarding the requirements of state ethics laws and the Open Public Meetings Act, especially with OPMA and all the changes related to COVID. This is TOR's chance to provide that annual update with you and let you guys know what's different right now regarding the governor's executive orders and OPMA. With that, I will turn it over to TOR.
Good morning, members of the board. This is Tor Jernad, your assigned Assistant Attorney General. Just want to verify that you can hear me and you can see my screen. Dennis, can you give me a thumbs up? Excellent, thank you. I was asked to speak on the issue of open public meetings because of potentially some of the challenges that arise in conjunction with the fact that we are doing them all remotely. And as you will see, when I move on a little bit further, you will see that, or you hear that there is actually one really interesting new case that highlights a number of the issues that actually are generated by the COVID and remote work impacts, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail. As always, I also want to add my disclaimer. This is not legal advice and not the official opinion of our office, and I say that because this is sort of a work in progress, if you will. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me directly. And also, if you're interested in the case that I will be discussing, I'd be happy to share it with you. So these are the things that I'm going to cover very, very briefly today. First is really just a reminder of the history and purpose of the Open Public Meetings Act. The second is just remind us sort of where we are in relation to COVID-19 and remote work. Third is just to give a brief overview of I'll call it the state response, but it has, in fact, been led by the governor's office for the most part. Then talk about some of those cases, or really one case that I want to bring to your attention today. And then just highlight maybe some of the lessons and challenges that come out of that, and then point you towards some additional resources if you're interested, and give you the opportunity to ask some questions. As you will most likely recall from many previous trainings, the OPMA and the Public Records Act both came about in the early 70s by virtue of a very strong movement at the time towards open government and a recognition, or really a desire to recognize the fact that we work for the people and not the other way around. And that the delegation does not encompass a right to decide what's good for people, but that it's important that they stay informed in every step of the process. And one of the most important elements of this is, of course, the liberal construction in terms of any judicial review of both the OPMA and the Public Records Act liberal construction means that if there's any uncertainty whatsoever, that it be resolved in favor of a finding really that something should be open or something should be disclosed. The default rule in respect to all meetings of all state agencies, all boards, all commissions is that all meetings are public unless a very specific narrow exception applies. And those and that mirrors really the language also in the Public Records Act, where the default is just open unless something comes up. There are, when thinking about this, you know, some of the key questions in court cases and judicial review is, you know, what is a meeting? And in particular, you know, for a board like the Left 2 board, you know, is a meeting of 2 a meeting? Is a meeting of 3 a meeting? You know, and ultimately it is a majority or a quorum. However, as you will hear from me again today, you need not be in the same place at the same time. Serial meetings are possible, and extreme vigilance on this question of who's talking to who is something that that is highly recommended. The other thing that really, the other key element of any of a meeting is an action, and an action, there's 2 easy ways to define this. An action is basically anything other than talking about the weather or sports, because of this liberal construction rule that I just mentioned earlier, and the fact that the Washington definition includes deliberations and discussions. So that is just, I mean, I hate to say dangerously, but it is quite broad, right? So, you know, if there's a borderline situation, you know, deliberations, discussions is pretty all-encompassing. I don't need to go into a recitation of you know, what's happened or where we are. I think that the most important thing to remember about where we are is we have been basically forced into a remote work situation, and our ways of doing business have changed. Maybe not so much changed as accelerated. You know, ultimately, back in the early 70s, when the OPMA and the PRA were both conceived, basically paper or records were preliminary paper. Email didn't exist, and you know, certainly the concept that we could be conducting video meetings was pie in the sky, right? So I think that the one thing to keep in mind about that is I mean, that's one thing to keep in mind, and the other thing I guess I would just highlight with this or bringing this up is just that there's still a lot of uncertainty regarding you know, where we're at and what's going to happen. In response, of course, to the events or really the understanding that COVID-19 spread on a person-to-person basis and was a pandemic that threatened really the health of the state of Washington, the state mobilized, and in essence, the governor led the response, and he did so by using really this tool. The primary tool at his disposal is this ability to declare a state of emergency, which allows the governor, in fact, to permit the waiver and suspension of any laws or rules that would in any way prevent, hinder, or delay unnecessary action in coping with the emergency. So that is an extraordinarily broad power. And what was really interesting about this is that I was part of a number of calls that came about in the AG's office where we gathered. We were an initial part of a bigger funnel that basically then took, gathered up information from state agencies and boards and commissions about how their work was being affected, and identified laws and rules that would be beneficial to identify and to potentially change or waive in order to help with the response, or rules that were rendered impossible to comply with by virtue of contradictory rules that basically are requirements of the health emergency. And, you know, the most obvious one in this context today is the contradiction between the governor's orders, basically that you couldn't have in-person meetings, and the requirement that there be open meetings. But it was a really interesting process because you got to hear from a really broad number of state agencies about how, in regards to how the work of the state was impacted. And I'll just say that in general, that I was really impressed with sort of how quickly the entire machinery of the state was able to sort of funnel or identify those into, gee, what do we address in order to, you know, to keep us working the way that we're supposed to. And in fact, you know, it was only shortly, you'll see the timeline here. So the proclamation initially came out on February the 29th, was the state of emergency. And there was then a wave of proclamations in March that addressed the specific specific laws and rules that hindered the response, including strict compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act, which you'll see identified there on March the 24th, less than a month after the original declaration of emergency. The other thing to note about the governor's power here in this case is, of course, that there is a legislative check on this, and that is that while the governor can extend these proclamations and the effect of them, it needs to be done with the consent in writing of the leadership of the Senate and the House of Representatives. So checks and balances in government, it's a good thing. It's just pointing it out. And in fact, the proclamation with respect to the Open Public Meetings Act, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, has been extended now. I think it's a total of 7, or, you know, it's like up to 8 or 9 times, because it wasn't always for month-long periods. Might actually be even 10 times at this point. With respect to the open public meetings, the initial proclamation had really three main components. One is we went from a permissive ability to conduct meetings telephonically and or by video to one where the only meetings that are allowed is through, at a minimum, telephonic access and or other electronic, internet, or other means of remote access, which is, of course, what we are doing at this very moment. And it barred in-person meetings. The second element of the initial proclamation was that there was a ban on action, which was sort of interesting because it contradicts, of course, the definition of a meeting, which I read to you earlier from the Open Public Meetings Act. Is it a meeting if you can't act? But there was some limitations to that. Those had to be limited to necessary and routine matters, or necessary for the response to COVID-19. Of course, the logical backdrop to that was that it was a time of transition. There was a concern that agencies or boards might do things that would surprise stakeholders who would otherwise not be able to participate, that transparency and confidence in government would be undermined if an emergency was used to to do something in a less than transparent fashion. Let's just put it that way. The other element of that initial proclamation was that it waived the requirement to physically post meeting notices. Since that original one, there have been really a couple of things that have happened. It has been extended a number of times. The leadership of the House and the Senate did consent to that. It is currently in effect through October the 1st. We, as unsurprisingly, expect it to be extended further. I don't think any of us know how long this will go, obviously. In terms of substantive changes, 2 things have happened. One is that prohibition against non-routine action just was allowed to expire, and subsequent renewals of the proclamation did not include that proclamation. So now I guess we're all expected. We've gotten used to this new mode of doing business. We have transparency back. We have hopefully confidence in government back. So there's that restriction no longer exists. The second thing that's occurred is that a limited exception has been created for some in-person meetings in phase 3 counties. I don't want to get into the definitions of the various counties. You guys know more about that than I do, probably. But just from a practical perspective, even if Thurston County, this becomes a really difficult interpretational question, because even if, let's say, the board is housed in Thurston County, and if Thurston County were to go to phase 3, what if you needed our board members needed to travel through phase 1 or phase 2 counties to a phase 3 county? That would be a practical consideration, and to be honest, I don't know how we would evaluate that. Another main thing to note about this very narrow exception is that the meeting must be adjourned if the meeting moves out of compliance with either the total number of participants or compliance with the health restrictions. So sort of oddly, while the exception is for less than 10 people today, if at some point an 11th person walks in the door, the chairman would be forced to adjourn the meeting. That could cause some practical difficulties. So while I've identified this as a change, it's not a path that I would recommend that our board chair walk down, even if it were to be technically possible with our, well, actually, it would be very difficult given that we have 10 board members. Sorry, I went the wrong way there. Now we get to the exciting part, which is really this one case that I wanted to talk about more than anything. But first, the backdrop. And that is that it was recognized quite a while ago that an exchange of emails, in this other case, Wood versus Battleground School District, that an exchange of emails could constitute a meeting. But they had this little safe harbor that was identified within that case, which was that the mere use or passive receipt of email does not actually constitute a meeting. So that, I mean, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the warning that I think both Steve and myself and others on the board have issued from time to time, and that is be very cautious of that reply all button on an email. That is perfectly okay for you to receive an email from Steve, but if you press reply all with a substantive thought or comment, then that could could enter into that danger zone of discussion or deliberations that I described from you from the actual act, right? But just in early September, about on the 9th of September, Court of Appeals Division 1 in Seattle just issued an opinion on this case, Arthur Vest versus Seattle City Council, which I want to go over with you guys briefly today. And there's first a couple of introductory things. One is the procedural posture is sort of interesting because the case was originally just summarily dismissed by the trial court in King County, I believe. And they said, Mr. West, you got no case, you're done. He appealed. And the case, the opinion that I'm talking about here, they reversed and remanded for proceedings consistent with their opinion. But their opinion, in other words, it's just sending it back to the trial court saying, hey, you guys messed this up, get it right, okay? And so the case is really interesting because it throws up some sort of guideposts, but it doesn't say, and it gives them some hints as to which direction to go, but we can't really read it as settled law quite yet. So I'm just throwing that out there. In regards to the facts, the case concerns a Seattle City Council action in May and June of 2018. And as you may recall, Jenny Durkin at the time was mayor. Bruce Harrell was the Seattle City Council president. As always, it's Seattle City Council is an interesting place with competing priorities. Let's just put it that way. And in early May, they had passed a resolution or had passed a new tax, which was an employee head tax on all large employers within the city of Seattle, which was intended to help raise money to fight homelessness and do other good things for the city. it was passed sort of quite hastily, I should say. I think that's a fair statement. And just slightly more than a month after it was passed, some of the council members were presented with some data. Actually, 4 of them met with a pollster from a company called EMC that I'm not familiar with, but I could take some guesses as to who they might be, who presented them with some information that this was deeply unpopular, this tax, and that it was a public relations disaster. And the case stems from the events then of the week following the receipt of that information. And what Mr. West argues is that a quorum of the council decided to repeal the employee head tax through a series of meetings, phone calls, and electronic communications, as evidenced by a draft press release, i.e. not something that even went out anywhere, and a tally sheet, which also was not, at least initially, a public document. So let me I'm going to repeat that. Through a series of meetings, phone calls, and electronic communications. So it wasn't just emails, it wasn't just texts, it wasn't just phone calls. It was a mix of all of the above. So we're now and so therefore this it becomes very relevant to the work that we're doing today, because that is in fact how most of us are conducting business, if you will. And what's particularly interesting about this case is that at no point in time did a majority of the members of the council, as presented in the recitation of facts in this case, a majority of council members never met and discussed this in either on a single email exchange or a single conference call or a single group text or a single in-person meeting. What happened was that at most 4 council members had this meeting. There was some exchanges with some employees of the mayor's office, and then there was a draft press release that was circulated, which is just fascinating, because none of it was in essence driven by the city council members themselves. So I'm going to pause there for just a second, and now to just pause and regroup. So you have West's postulation that there was these series meetings, and then what I just said, which was really a conclusory statement about they didn't meet. Okay, so then you might ask themselves, well, what sort of actually happened? Well, we weren't there. But what's recited in the case is this initial meeting, and then the mayor's office, or the deputy mayor's office, I should say, the mayor's office, I think that's an accurate characterization. The public relations staff and the deputy mayors did some basically polling and discussions of council members through various means, right? Some were text, some were phone calls, some were emails, where they said, hey, we got this polling, things look really bad. What do you think about repeal, right? What do you think about undoing this really bad thing that we did? And it's one thing for that to be like a one-way communication, but what happened is that it went one step further that, and they didn't just schedule a meeting where they could potentially consider a repeal. What happened was that they were eager to get the news of this out, given the unpopularity at the time, and that is my interpretation, that eagerness. So I'm going to caution you with that. But they drafted a press release, and I say they. It truly was they. It initially started with the mayor's office, but then it ended up being City Council President Bruce Harrell's office that reviewed a draft. They drafted a press release where they indicated that a majority of the City Council approves the repeal. Then that draft was circulated amongst council members, and another person kept a tally sheet where they basically kept track of who agreed with this press release. So a press release. So in essence, they were voting on the press release, and the question is, and thereby potentially committing themselves to a course of action in a meeting that hadn't taken place. There is the potential violation. I'm saying it's not. I'm not going to say it is a violation because this case was remanded for consideration consistent with what the court has said here. So it's not a finding at this point, but that is where they got to. And in particular, I want to now that I've told you a little bit about it, and hopefully it's not too confusing, I'm gonna come to you with really what I view as the key sentence in terms of the court statement on this, and that is that they say this. They say, but there's evidence that on June 11th, 2018, after Harrell submitted a bill to repeal the employee head tax and scheduled a vote on that bill for the following day, 7 council members signed on to the draft press release stating that the repeal bill had, quote, the support of a majority of the city council. Each of the 7 council members submitted a declaration in which they stated they did not discuss with any other council member the substance of the statement, and that by joining the statement, quote, they didn't understand or intend that by doing so, they indicated how they would vote. On the one hand, they told someone that they approved that press release. On the other hand, in the testimony as part of this case, they said, we didn't know what we were doing. This is the court's conclusion. The text of what each was asked to review and approve, however, seemed to express a very different sentiment. And then the court goes on to once again get back to this language of this bill had the support of a majority of the council. So there you have it. It has been remanded. We're going to see what happens in the end, but I think that some of the it's an extraordinarily interesting situation by virtue of the fact that it was a hybrid meeting, if you will, not just a serial email meeting, not just a 6 people had a phone conference and stepped over a line, not a reply all. It's the fact that it was a combination of text, email, and phone calls, where a spider, if you will, the person who basically circulated that draft, and or the person who kept the tally sheet, basically coordinated a meeting, but where none of the council members none of them testified to the fact that they were part of a meeting. But nonetheless, the court appears to be going in that direction. So, this is, it's worth noting because this is the world that we live in today. So I'm going to keep going for just a second. I'm sure you may or may not have some questions on this. And I'm going to send you the case just so you have a chance to take a look at it yourself. It just came out, 2 weeks ago, so still sort of analyzing it. But in any case, it highlights, I think, that some of the challenges of on the one hand, actually doing what we're supposed to do and doing what the board is supposed to do, conducting business and managing oversight and staying safe. And on the other hand, complying with the regulations of open government and public comment. I just threw 1 or 2 other things in here on this chart. I don't really mean to talk about them. They're just sort of like little asterisks or warning signs. That is that we shouldn't forget that we also still obligated to comply with the ADA. And it may be more, and that while for the first, meeting or 2 or 3 or some period of time, that perhaps there may be quite a bit of leeway in terms of expectations, both from persons who have claims and courts and or stakeholders, that as we go along and as we move on in time, if this becomes the new normal, then we may also need to take some further steps to ensure that we're compliant with other requirements. In regards to the case that I just discussed, or that I just went over, and the OPMA in general, the liability is real. It was sort of interesting that one in particular. They talked about the council may have violated, the council members may have violated. They weren't really clear where they thought that liability rested, because that's up to now the trial court to decide once again. But board members can be personally liable for in essence, participating in a meeting where action is taken, and there was an intent to basically to conduct the board's business someplace other than an open public forum. So I'll just remind you of that. I would say that, the comments that I've said this before in all my other trainings, I think that, your guiding principle should always be, common sense, and just ask questions if something doesn't seem quite right. I've here assembled some further resources that I've talked about here today that are good guideposts for the OPMA and just in general. You obviously, I am at your disposal 24/7. You have my card, you have my phone numbers. Feel free to call me. The AG's office has a very good open government resource page. In addition, the Municipal Research and Services Center serves local governments and provides a lot of information, some of which is more accessible, if you will, maybe than the AG's office. We tend to be a little more legal. They do a really good job of putting things in great, easily accessible language. In regards to where we are now, the coronavirus Washington.gov state website is a great single resource, and the governor's office is, of course, where they keep the proclamations and official actions. And with that, I apologize for rambling on quite a bit. We geek out on new cases that are exciting. I'm just going to go ahead and send it all to you, because that would not be a meeting. It would be information. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
All right, Tor. Thank you very much. Any questions? I'm just happy you admitted you're a geek. That's pretty good. Any questions for him? All right. Thank you. Executive Director Nelson, you still around?
I'm here.
There you are.
When you get towards email, make sure you don't hit reply all. But
that's right.
I'll do a quick administrative update, and I'll include item 9 or 8, the COVID-19 update, along with that. So first off, expectation interviews have begun. For those of you who are newer to the board or brand new, each year I meet with you to go over what your individual expectations are for me and for the team as a board member. What is it that you individually want? And then we usually have a presentation on that at the strategic planning meeting. We're off to a bit of a late start this year, so I'm not sure we'll be able to get all those interviews done in time for the October meeting, but I hope we can. And those are, I know I've got the first one, I think, scheduled next week. Jesse has reached out to all of you. Those will all be done remotely. If you happen to live locally and you want to meet in person, I'm open to that. But otherwise, they'll all be done by phone or video. That's different from years past, where I would come out and meet with you one-on-one, face-to-face in your hometown to kind of facilitate that open communication. But this is intended to be a one-time deviation from that practice, and simply related to kind of the difficulties right now with travel and the concerns that everybody has regarding COVID. Jesse's sending out a survey, I think, to all of you today. Please look for that and respond to that. If you don't receive that, let Jesse know. The other item that I wanted to briefly hit on is the November meeting. That is a strategic planning meeting. In the past, we've done it off-site, also in order to kind of facilitate that open communication that between you guys, where you're not kind of sitting at I think the SIB table, the horseshoe shape is actually a really good design, but even kind of making it less formal even than that. This year, that's not going to happen. So it's all going to be video. And the plan is right now, all the remaining board meetings for the interim will be remote meetings. Once session starts, it's always been past practice that those meetings during session would also be remote. So at this point in time, we're not anticipating the possibility of any kind of in-person LEF2 board meetings until, at the very earliest, the end of this upcoming session. We'll keep you posted if anything, how things look during session. It's hard to project right now how things are going to change 6-7 months down the road from now, but we'll keep you posted. But that kind of ties in with the COVID-19 update. There has been no changes in board practices. The board office is open, but for the most part, there's nobody here most days. We have some employees here occasionally, but we have signs posted on all the doors about how to get a hold of us. All phone calls are answered, all emails are answered, so we've been taking care of business. We just haven't been in the office 24/5, or well, at least 8/5, like we had been before. So we'll talk a little bit more about, I'll talk with each of you about some of the COVID stuff in our one-on-ones, and then there may be some discussion about that at the November meeting as well. Did you guys have any questions about any of those topics? I know I kind of blew through all of them real quick. If not, then the next LEF2 board meeting for November, I don't have the date in front of me, and I'm embarrassed to say right now that I don't have it memorized.
November 9th.
Thank you. Yeah, I knew it was coming up quick. We moved it up. We'll be getting agenda and materials out to you fairly shortly. We're going to try to keep it a little bit shorter than perhaps past meetings. Hit you with 3 or 4 key topics, with each of them maybe being in the area to anticipate it about 30 minutes, but we'll see, depending on your appetite for engagement and discussion in this kind of remote format. So it shouldn't be the same as what you had experienced in the past, where oftentimes those meetings would go all the way right up to 3:30. This may be a different experience. Leaving that aside, that is all that I have for you, Mr. Chair, members of the board.
Are there any questions for Steve? All right. Would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Holy.
Second. Jason, you. Jason?
Second.
All right, Jason. So we have a motion made and second to adjourn. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none, we will be adjourned. And I'd like to thank the board for participating. I know it's difficult. It's definitely strange, but thank you. Thanks to the staff and the team. You guys do a great job. Tammy, you're an IT tech now. We're just going to reclassify you and give you another little bump. So just to let you know. So you're awesome. So, all right. Thanks, everybody.